بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم وسبحان الله العلي العظيم والحمد لله رب العالمين. الحمد لله نحمده ونستعينه ونستنصره ونستهديه، فإنه حقا من هدى الله فلا مضل له ومن يضلله فلا هادي له، ونصلي ونسلم ونبارك على الحبيب المصطفى النبي الأمين المرسل رحمة للعالمين، وعلى آله الأطهار الميامين، وعلى أصحابه المختارين، وعلى من اتبعه بإحسان إلى يوم الدين. اللهم يا علي يا عظيم، اللهم افتح بيننا وبين قومنا بالحق، اللهم افتح بيننا وبين قومنا بالحق، اللهم لا تزغ قلوبنا بعد إذ أن هديتنا، لا إله إلا أنت، فاغفر لنا ذنوبنا وكفر عنا سيئاتنا. سبحانك رب العزة عما يصفون، والحمد لله رب العالمين، وسلام على المرسلين. Recently, this past week, it was reported rather widely by a number of newspaper outlets or a number of news outlets that in an interview on Channel 24, an Israeli Channel 24, in an interview with Benjamin Netanyahu, the interviewer had a medallion of so-called Greater Israel. And as we'll talk about the concept of Greater Israel, is the belief that God in the Old Testament promised the Prophet Ibrahim alayhi salam the lands between the Nile to the Euphrates, that the lands between the Nile in Egypt and the Euphrates in Iraq belonged to the descendants of Ibrahim. In especially Messianic Zionist ideology, that is interpreted as a land promised to the Jews, that in fact, according to this version of Zionism, that the lands between the Nile in Egypt and the Euphrates in Iraq is land promised to the Jews. Now, of course, notice here that per this interpretation, the sons of Abraham do not include Muslims and do not include Christians, but is limited exclusively to Jews. So the interviewer had a medallion reflecting that ideology of the Greater Israel. And the interviewer asks Netanyahu whether he is still committed Now, of course, you notice here the idea of still committed. Now, I don't know, and I've tried to look into this and didn't come out with something definite, but apparently the interviewer had knowledge that perhaps I could not find, that Netanyahu had a clear prior commitment to the concept of Greater Israel. But in any case, the interviewer asks Netanyahu whether he is still committed to the concept of Greater Israel. And Netanyahu responds that indeed he is committed to the idea of Greater Israel. And Netanyahu goes on to explain that he feels that he is on a mission historically and spiritually. And he says that I am on a mission historically and spiritually, and the answer is yes. Now, of course, what caught my attention, and I will elaborate, I will say something about this whole concept and so on, that the message resonated with a number of Arab capitals, and because it is understood that the idea of Greater Israel, especially in this version of Zionism, that is quite old, as we will talk about, a number of Arab capitals protested and objected. So objections or protests to Netanyahu's continued commitment to the concept of Greater Israel came from Saudi, came from Jordan. In the Jordanian foreign minister, Sufyan Oda, said these allegations and delusions promoted by extremists within the Israeli government encourage a continuation of cycles of violence and conflict and require a clear international stance condemning them. Now, we immediately notice a number of things, but the Arab response, as usual, immediately thinks of an international community that does not exist, relies on international guarantees that do not exist, hopes that the restraint will come from some type of international norms that do not, in fact, apply or exist when it comes to the State of Israel. All reliance, and this is a critical point, is not on their own people. It's not on the Saudi people or the Jordanian people or the Iraqi people or the Syrian people or the Lebanese people or the Egyptian people as a safeguard against aggression and against Messianic claims. But from the age of colonialism to our very day, you completely put your own roots and your own foundations aside, and you rely on the hope that the very foreign power that colonizes you, that dominates you, that controls your fate, will somehow, some way, in some form, spare you. And so the protests from Saudi Arabia and the protests from Jordan were rather predictable. The international community should condemn, the international community should find reprehensible, the international community should make a stand, while at the same time you continue to repress and silence and dominate your own people. So it is the international community that you bank on, whatever that means. Because, of course, when you talk about the international community, you are not talking about Asian states, you are not talking about African states, you are not talking about South American states. You are relying, this is code for the dominant powers that colonize and control the world. When you say international community, you mean the United States, Britain, France, Germany. That intoxication with the Western world, as the Western world is seen as the holder of all the cards, an absolute reliance on the same Western world that in the Sykes-Picot agreements after World War I divided up and carved the Muslim world into nation states. The same Western world that decided that the Al Saud family from Najd should control the Hijaz, and that Saudi Arabia should have the borders that it has, and that Kuwait should have the borders that it has, and that Qatar should have the borders that it has. That same international world is now that you are hoping is going to, in somehow, some way, act as a restraint as to any possible colonial, expansionist designs that Israel might have. And notice, of course, that hardly a response came out from the Syrian government, which is busy hating the Shia. Hardly a response came out from the Iraqi government, and hardly a response came out from the subservient and completely subservient and docile Egyptian government. The concept of Greater Israel includes parts of Lebanon, parts of Jordan, parts of Egypt, parts of Iraq, parts of Saudi Arabia. And notice in the response by the Jordanian foreign minister, he talks about extremist elements within the Israeli government, putting aside completely that these are not extremist elements within the Israeli government, but this is Netanyahu himself, the prime minister of Israel, who is saying what he is saying. This is the same Israeli government that has inflicted a genocide and has carried out a genocide against the Palestinian people now for 2 years. This is the same Israeli government and the same Prime Minister of Israel who has jettisoned Messianic Zionist powers to rule over Israel, in fact, giving them the entire keys of the kingdom. Yet, here's the thing. We all know that this is not, or we should know, that this is not a new concept. There's nothing here that surprises, nothing here that shocks. Theodore Herzl, in his memoirs, wrote very openly. In fact, if you have access to his memoirs, Theodor Herzl, the founder of Zionism, on page 711 of his diaries or memoirs, talks very openly about the belief that God promised the descendants of Abraham, and as we said, by the descendants of Abraham in political Zionism, especially this extremist form of Zionism that is in power now and that has been in power in Israel a number of times. The descendants of Abraham are interpreted as a promise to the Jewish people. So even in the diaries of Theodor Herzl, where he speaks very openly that God promised us the lands between the Nile and the Euphrates, and everyone understands that there is hardly anything new under the sun. And to just put it in clear terms, since Muslims don't read, and because they don't read, they don't have much of a memory or hardly awareness. In the 1970s, as early as 1970, a Palestinian scholar, his name was As'ad Razzouk, or actually, before we get to As'ad's work, let's first take someone else. Also in 1970, Khaled Kishtiyani, who was also a Palestinian scholar, published a rather extensive, well-documented, thoroughly referenced study called Whither Israel, a study of Zionist expansionism. And in there, Khaled Kishtiyani talked at length about schools within Zionism that believed that historical Israel is not limited to Palestine, but in fact extends well beyond Palestine. That ideology has ebbed and flowed. So it saw a lot of popularity after 1967. Then it sort of became unpopular during the Oslo Accords. Before the Oslo Accords in 1982, it again saw a lot of popularity, but there's no question that among the Messianic Zionist parties in power now, Netanyahu's clique, that this form of Messianic Zionism that dreams of greater Israel is widely accepted. As'ad Razzouk also published a study called Greater Israel, a study in Zionist expansionist thought in 1970. Again, thoroughly referenced, thoroughly documented, He goes back to the origins, the religious origins of the idea, and the role it played in inspiring various orientations within the Zionist movement. More recently, Noor Masalha, in his book, The Bible and Zionism, published in 2007, if I remember correctly, Noor Masalha discusses building upon the research of Kishtayani and Razou, but also doing his own archival research. Noor Masalha in The Bible and Zionism discusses this whole ideology very extensively. Max Blumenthal, in his book Goliath, discusses the same quite extensively. And I could go on. Israel Shahak, in his book Open Secrets, Expansionism and Israeli Foreign Policy, has a very well referenced and very well documented discussion on this idea, this Messianic Zionist school of thought. I'm blanking out on the name of someone else. Who was it after Israel Shahak? Oh yes. The book, The Iron Wall, by Avi Shleim. There is also a book other than The Iron Wall by Avi Shleim. There is a book, I believe, if I remember correctly, it was called Open Secrets. And I believe it was by Avi Shleim as well, although don't quote me on that. I'm not sure who wrote Open Secrets. But all of these works discuss the same idea and the same notion within Messianic Zionism. The idea that from the Nile to the Euphrates, including parts of Lebanon, parts of Syria, all of Jordan, parts of Iraq, parts of Egypt, parts of Saudi Arabia, are all part of the promised land. And part of this Messianic Zionism is the conviction that this is promised land, meaning we are entitled to it. So if we forego the conquest, if we don't conquer this land, it is an act of grace. It is an act of generosity. And so you owe us for foregoing the land that was promised to us. So when we tell you we don't want the Palestinians and the Palestinians should go to Saudi Arabia, as Netanyahu actually said, well, Saudi Arabia has a lot of land, why don't they take the Palestinians? It comes from this old idea within Messianic Zionism that this land was promised to us. So if we tell you we're not going to conquer this land, you owe us. So when we tell you bear the burden of the Palestinians, we have a right to do so because, after all, we're allowing you to hold on to land that belongs to us and belongs to us by biblical promise, because God. And in this interpretation, again, the sons of Abraham do not include Christians and Christians and Muslims. Sons of Abraham is interpreted as exclusively the Israelites. The Iron Wall, Open Secrets, Goliath. You can even add the book, The Fateful Triangle, which I believe is still in print, although it's quite now. But why even mention all of this? There was a rather infamous study by an Israeli in 1982. His name was Oded Yinon. Oded Yinon published a study called Greater Israel, the Zionist Plan for the Middle East. Actually, he was not a scholar analyzing Messianic Zionism. He was an advocate. Oded Yinon in 1982 argued that for Israel to have a secure future, we must insist on a sectarian Middle East. We must turn Sunnis against Shia, Muslims against Druze, Arab Christians against Arab Muslims. We must make sure that this entire region remains conquered, divided, warring with one another, Arab against Kurd. And we must establish Greater Israel so that Israel will never have a water crisis, will never have an oil crisis, will never have a gas crisis, and in fact, Israel will remain the only superpower in the region. Because only then can Israel be a superpower on the international front. Now, in the midst, at the same time, that Netanyahu offensively, arrogantly, and openly says, yes, I am on a social, historical, religious mission, and I still dream of Greater Israel. And here's the thing, Netanyahu knows very well that tomorrow, if he wanted to conquer Egypt, the Egyptian army would crumble in a day or two. And the Jordanian army would crumble in a day or two. And the Saudi army would crumble in a day or two. Netanyahu knows very well that these are paper armies, that these are armies, militaries, that are competent in one thing and one thing only: repressing their own people. Their own people who are not armed. Netanyahu knows very well that these rulers fear no one like their own people, the very people they rule over. Netanyahu knows very well that these are thoroughly corrupted, rotten armies. Rotted from the very core. Netanyahu knows very well that every general in the Egyptian army, Jordanian army, Syrian army, Saudi army has Swiss bank accounts and accounts in New York and fears nothing more than death. And that the minute they find any type of risk to their life, they will run away, abandon their own people, betray their own nations, and go to a Western capital to enjoy their wealth and their ill-gained money. Netanyahu knows very well that these are paper armies, lies, fictions. If there is any reason that the Messianic Zionist idea cannot be fulfilled, it is because of the type of resistance that Israel met in Gaza, or the type of resistance that Israel met in Lebanon, not from formal Arab armies and governments, but here's the tragedy. 3 points that I want to make. One, the Trump administration, as well as Zionists of all types, want to tell you that by listening to what Netanyahu said, by reading scholarship, by even reading what Theodore Herzl said about Greater Israel and the land promised to Jews, that it is anti-Semitic. So not to be anti-Semitic, I should listen to what Netanyahu said and say, oh, he doesn't mean it. Yeah, Muslims, even when Muslims say left and right, we don't believe in terrorism, they're liars. That's not racist. It's not racist to give the lie to Muslims at every twist and turn. That's not racist. To tell Muslims, I don't believe you. You are just pretending to be decent, but you're not. And no matter how many times you swear that you are X, Y, and Z, I have every right to doubt you because I distrust you, I distrust your prophet, I distrust your Quran, I distrust your God, I distrust everything. That's not racist. But to actually listen to what your eyes see, what your ears hear, in other words, to actually take the Prime Minister of Israel seriously, that's anti-Semitic. You are supposed to listen to Netanyahu and say, nah, he doesn't mean it. No, there's no danger. Yeah, I know Messianic Zionists are in government. I know they said they have every intention of genociding the Palestinian people, but it doesn't count. It's not, yes, they said they want to exterminate all Palestinians, but it doesn't matter. Don't see what you see, don't hear what you hear. Live in denial so you're not considered anti-Semitic. So, although this has been thoroughly documented, and let me be very clear, what is thoroughly documented? What is thoroughly documented is that Messianic Zionism believes that the land from Egypt to Iraq was promised by God to the descendants of Abraham, which, as I explained, is interpreted as exclusively their Israelites. What has been thoroughly documented is that this school of thought in Messianic Zionism is in power in Israel today. And that they are the people responsible for a full-scale genocide against the Palestinian people. But this is what powerlessness does. What powerlessness does is that facts don't matter. History doesn't matter. Reality doesn't matter. You must live in a state of false consciousness and denial in order to appease power. The second point. First point is the ironies and paradoxes of anti-Semitism compared to Islamophobia. Islamophobia, the same people who accuse others of anti-Semitism, these very same people say we have a right to malign the Prophet, malign the Quran, malign the entire Islamic civilization, and you can't accuse us of being racist because we're truth seekers. We just speak our truth. How dare you call us racist? But if you return the gaze in any way, regardless of how legitimate your gaze is, you're racist. You're an anti-Semite. My second point. Do you know that throughout the Muslim world, I was watching some smart Arab kid who got the idea of creating a program on social network by calling up people in the Middle East, various people in Syria, in Egypt, in Jordan, in Iraq, and just off the cusp, once he has them on TikTok or whatever it is, he then asks them, starts talking about the genocide in Gaza. And without fail, every person, he has called some over 100 people, and every person this guy has contacted in Egypt, in Jordan, in Iraq, in Syria, can't wait to get off the line because of absolute terror about the consequences of speaking on TikTok about a genocide. So every person that responded says, yeah, I feel horrible, but then immediately tries to get off. Terror and oppression is in our very blood. And that is why I am telling you, I would not be at all surprised if in the life of my sons or my grandchildren, not because Arab governments are corrupt, and they are, but because the Arab people are a broken, terrorized people, I would not be surprised if Messianic Zionists do achieve their dream of a greater Israel, an Israel that is a superpower on the world stage. Do you really think that the United States or Europe will act as any type of restraint on Israel if it decides and when it decides that it wants to conquer more land? And all the suffering that the Egyptians sat and watched their fellow Palestinians go through as they did nothing. The same as to Jordanians, the same as to Jordanians, the same as to Lebanese, the same as to Iraqis, the same as to Syrians. They will in turn go through that suffering. And a Middle East dominated by a new superpower is an entirely new epoch in history. Third point, the ironies of all irony, and it speaks volumes. At the very same time when Netanyahu said, yes, I believe in greater Israel, and I am on a historical and religious mission to achieve greater Israel, Iran is going through a water crisis, and Netanyahu speaks to the Iranian people and say, get rid of your government and Israel will help you. Although Israel has no water but stolen water from its neighbors. But Israel tells the Iranian people, we will help you with your water crisis. So at the same time that you are planning to conquer and dominate fellow Muslims, in the same way that you butchered and murdered Palestinians, you know, I remember when I was in college, every Zionist professor I had, in every paper, in reactions to papers that I wrote, because I was a political science major, they would mock the idea of pan-Arabism. They would mock that idea of pan-Islamism. They would insist that pan-Arabism is dead. They would insist that pan-Islamism is dead. And it is remarkable. Because in the same way that the Jordanian politicians do not think of the Jordanian people as the best safeguard against Israeli expansionist policies, in the same way that the Saudi government does not think that the Saudi people are the best guarantee against the expansionist policies of the Israeli government, or the Egyptian government does not think of the Egyptian people as the best guarantee against the expansionist policies of the Israeli government. In fact, they will do Israel a great favor. They will oppress their own people, just as the Palestinian authorities did vis-a-vis Palestinians under their control. We will oppress them. We will murder them. We will jail them. We will torture them. We will get them out of the way so you can conquer and colonize. In the same way that this is true, what is amazing, what is confounding, as Netanyahu says, I still believe in greater Israel, and I'm still committed to the idea of greater Israel, do the Syrians say, oh my God, we need to ally ourselves not just with the Turks, we need to ally ourselves with the Iranians, because we all are one people. Do the Sunnah and Shia say, what differences? What the silliness that we go about the companions, and whether you call Aisha this or we all have one faith. We are one people. Do the Saudis say the only real guarantee we have is to ally ourselves with the historical forces that defined Islamicity? No, absolutely not. We still hear the garbage about Sunni Shi'i, about progressive traditional, about fundamentalist liberal, about all the garbage. If you were God, What would you do with people who are so deluded, who are so ignorant, who refuse to be educated? I just named a bunch of books in this very khutbah. How many Muslims out there do you think will look up these sources and read the sources? I have lived long enough to tell you it won't be more than what you would count on a single hand. Because they can't wait to go attend a khutbah or a lesson by Sheikh, I don't know, Battikh ibn Battikh about jinn, or about the hijab, or about how you do dua, or about any other nonsense. Read books, actually develop an intellect, cognition, education. Nah. We are a derivative people with derivative histories, with derivative societies, with a derivative will, with a derivative determination, with a derivative future. What would you do if you were God? أقول قولي هذا استغفر الله لي ولكم أسأل الله يستجب لكم. بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم والحمد لله رب العالمين وسبحان الله العلي العظيم اللهم صل وسلم وبارك على محمد وعلى آله وأصحابه وعلى من تبعه بإحسان إلى يوم الدين. Another news item that caught my attention, and this one for American Muslims is nothing short of a complete and absolute disaster. Secretary of State Marco Rubio in response to a question, he reportedly said that he is in the process of designating CAIR as a terrorist organization. Let me be very clear. If CAIR is designated as a terrorist organization, it means anyone that has worked with CAIR, anyone who even interned with CAIR, anyone who has given money to CAIR can be prosecuted as a supporter of terrorism. Designating CAIR as a terrorist organization is not about just CAIR. It is a blow to American Muslims, and indeed any Muslims that exercise their constitutional right under the First Amendment. And the way the law is written is such that if you are prosecuted for giving money to CAIR, you will not have the legal right to question the designation of CAIR as a terrorist organization. Let me be again. I had a student at law school, a Jewish student, who after graduating from UCLA Law worked as an attorney, Jewish student, with CAIR in LA. She was a woman of conscience, believed that as a believing, practicing Jewish woman, she has the obligation to defend the civil rights of Muslims. And so she worked with CAIR. And unlike so many Muslims, she didn't complain about the pay. And she didn't complain about her career. And anyway, a woman like that could be prosecuted if CAIR is designated as a terrorist organization for giving material support to a terrorist organization. And she would not have the legal right to say CAIR is not a terrorist organization. The only legal question would be, did she give material support? That would be the only legal issue. But the designation of CAIR as a terrorist organization can only be questioned by CAIR itself. And the way the law is written, CAIR will not have a full legal right to thoroughly, truly question that designation. Marco Rubio speaks about designating CAIR as a terrorist organization and thus sending a message to Muslims everywhere. If you dream of practicing your political rights, if you dream of organizing to defend your civil rights, you do so at great risk. And the federal government will have the power to turn your life upside down, to persecute you, and tie you up. And let me be very clear that you might tell yourself, oh no, but I know that there are rights and there are constitution and there are civil rights, and I am sure there is a law. Yes. But the federal government can tie you up in litigation and hold you in detention as this litigation goes through for a minimum of 10 years. Do you see? This is all the byproduct of what despotism produces, what Muslim cowardliness generates, what a state of oblivion and delusion creates. Netanyahu talks openly about invading and occupying the Holy Land. And Muslims talk about the right to go to Umrah and to Hajj. A few years ago, there was a fellow who wrote a book. I think it was called something like The Path to Mecca. I can bring up the title of the book and the name of the fellow, in which he argues that Israel should be the power in the Middle East that controls and runs Hajj and Umrah. He argues, of course he's a Messianic Zionist, he argues that instead of the Saudis, we should do away with the Saudis, and Israel should be the one who controls Mecca and Medina. And Israel should be the one that regulates Hajj and Umrah. And Israel should be the one that profits from Hajj and Umrah. And he argues in his book that it is a great sign that Muslims only care about material luxuries. As long as Israel allows the Las Vegas atmosphere in Mecca and Medina, Muslims will be happy. And it's a win-win situation. Get rid of hated people, the Saudi ruling family, do away with them, replace them with the Israelis, and experience has shown us that if you dominate Muslims, they obey. And I am sure that the Hamza Yusufs of the world will come up and say, this is Allah's will. Yes, Israel is in control. Go ahead, do Umrah and Hajj. No issue. Even a paranoid, not paranoid, but what I pray is just delusions, insanity, such as a book like this. But the truly scary thing is that I know, although it's rational people would look at a book like this and say you're crazy. But you and I know that it is thoroughly implementable the way Muslims are today. In the same way that Muslims fail to react because of a genocide, fail to react when the Secretary of State says, I will designate CAIR as a terrorist organization, and the Muslim Brotherhood, by the way. That's what he said. He said both the Muslim Brotherhood and CAIR. And still, Muslim doctors all around the country will still think about upgrading their kids' cars, securing their kids with new houses, making sure their kids have impressive weddings that people will talk about, making sure that their kids have this property. Muslim doctors all over the country will not wake up and say, this is what happens when you fail to stand up against Islamophobia. If we would have spent the money in the 90s, we would not be in the shape we're in today. Why do I say Muslim doctors? Because they're the ones that have money. اللهم اعف عنا اللهم اغفر لنا اللهم ارحمنا يا رحمن يا رحيم وتب علينا يا تواب واهدنا لأقرب من هذا رشدا. Allah forgive our sins. Allah forgive our sins. Allah help us to wake up. Increase our knowledge. Help us against our demons, the demons that subjugate us, that humiliate us, that make us a non-people on the stage of humanity. Ya Ali Ya Azim, Ya Rabb al-Alameen, wa aqim as-salah.